Okay, but let's come back to the basics. What is an independent state? What is a democracy? And what does it mean for there to be democratic development, which is one of the things we're trying to trace from the period of the post war or even the American era when democracy was introduced up until Module 10, which is post EDSA, right? So, first question is, what is an independent state? Now, this is tied to the global history of the creation of nation states. But instead of explaining that, what I'm going to do is zoom in on the post World War II era when independent states started to be formed out of previous colonies, similar to the Philippines. So, independent states have their own territories, populations, governments, and are recognized by other states. This is what makes them independent. So theoretically, no other state has the right to intervene in the government affairs of the other. So pag independent ka na, hindi pwedeng i-dictate ng ibang country na ito yung magiging policy nyo on exports and imports or on military development. But that's theoretically. In practice, minsan, nagkaka-stronger influences yung mas malalaking states. So, kung may mga independent state na iba't ibang uri din, you have monarchies that are independent states. Um, anyway, madaming kinds. Yung idea lang ay, yung sa atin ay democracy. Pero ano nga ba ang democracy? So, democracy is a kind of state usually called a republic. And this is rooted in the Greek democratic tradition of forming republics. We don't need to talk about that now. In republics, or at least democratic republics, it is the citizens of the country, rather than a monarch, aristocrat, or dictator, who decide on laws through their elected representatives. So yun yung keys dun, no? My elected representatives. Or in a way, pwede din nating i-define ang democracy as a government that is ruled by the people, for the people, and of the people. So, yung key talaga ng independent state na to, of a democracy, is that the people who are ruled are able to dictate or are able to agree upon the ways that they will be ruled. Now, in practice, this is a little more complicated, lalo na when we elect representatives, because representatives don't always carry the interests of their people or constituents when they create laws. But theoretically, that's what a democracy is. Now, what is democratic development then? Now, if we think about democracy as inherently participatory, or, where people, or it is a government ruled by the people, for the people, and of the people, and we believe in that idea, then we can look at the development or the expansion of different aspects of politics when democracies develop. And I've outlined three key ideas here. So, when a democracy develops, you have an increased ability of the general public to participate in governance through a higher level of political education and accessibility of government processes. And this sounds complicated, no? But really, when you think about it, parang yung sa present day, right? So right now, we have all kinds of systems in place which would dictate what happens when there's another wave of the COVID variant, for example, right? Now, if we are to test the level of democratic development in this situation, you ask yourself, when people talk about the powers of the president, for example, or the powers of different military and other institutions in determining these protocols for us, how how much are people able to articulate ideas on proper responsibilities? So, ano nga ba yung responsibilities ng iba't ibang institutions, like health institutions, like the DOH? What are their responsibilities, obligations? What are they supposed to do? And how do we hold them accountable? How do we call out malpractice, or from a different perspective naman, how do we support initiatives which we believe are helpful for us as citizens? So, when people participate through discussions or through petitions, clamoring, um, talking to legislators, you first need to know something about the system in place. And that's what political education does. So, with a higher amount of political education, ideally, people will have better discussions and better suggestions on how the country should be ruled. But it doesn't matter no matter how good your ideas are, if there is no way to access government processes for these ideas to be heard, then ill-developed pa yung democratic system mo. So there has to be a way, a feedback process for government officials in power to listen to these suggestions and to implement them or to improve upon them. So yun yung idea of increased participation. So we also have the increased representation of non-elite interests in law. So siguro ito na yung part ng feedback process. For example, one very concrete issue no is right now the protocols on vaccination priorities, right? So when we look at the A1, A2, and A3 categories, this will necessitate who gets the vaccines first. So, di ba dun sa ibang categories, pumapasok yung essential workers. So, pag dinidefine na natin yung essential workers through these kinds of government practices, we ask the question of, nare-represent ba yung non-elite interests in these particular mechanisms? If yes, then good. If no, then why not? So let's try to analyze the current situation, right? I think up until present, hindi pa rin recognized as essential workers yung ibang tao na nagde-deliver ng food, even if a large part of the population in urban areas relies on these. Remember yung issue na hindi naman essential yung lugaw, so bakit papadaanin yung ibang food panda and delivery people who are moving from one place to another in Metro Manila. So that's precisely it. When we think about uh essential workers, usually hindi naiisip yung smaller jobs that are more irregular often, even if the economy kind of relies on them to continue and to persist. So that's just a very small, very rough example, no, of how non-elite interests may or may not be represented in laws, the dispersion of funding. So in terms of the dispersion of funding, di ba nakita natin in the past years, naglalabas yung government every now and then of uh, yung ayuda. So it's actually theoretically a good thing because the ayuda is meant for people who do not have jobs to at least have something to last them for a couple of weeks or yeah, theoretically kung enough yung mabibigay na resources. So dun pumapasok yung idea of dispersion of funding, the creation of services, gaya ng vaccination program, di ba? Actually, maganda theoretically at even in application yung ibang aspects ng vaccination program natin kasi it focuses on certain vulnerable populations like the elderly, indigents, or populations that tend to be poorer in certain parts of Philippine society, di ba? So, ayun, pag nare-represent yung interests ng mga tao na to, masasabi nating, okay, may democratic development. And finally, may increased protection of the rights already enshrined in our Constitution. So, ang Constitution kasi ay yung ideal form ng government niyo. So, kung anong ilalagay sa Constitution, yun yung parang kasunduan eh. Kasunduan ng mga taong sumusunod sa mga batas ng isang bansa na susunod kami sa inyo pero ito dapat yung ibabalik niyong responsibilidad sa amin. Kaya merong definitions dun of who the population of the Philippines is, and therefore who the Philippine government is responsible for, the territory that we have, which we should be responsible for as well in protecting in order to ensure that we have natural resources to help us develop our industries and support our population. Meron din tayong Bill of Rights. I think that's Article 3 of the Constitution, where it is very explicitly stated what kinds of rights should be protected under Philippine law. So, in theory, yun yung ipaprotect dapat ng government. Pero alam natin na minsan hindi nasusunod yung mga prinsipyong yun for various reasons. For example, on the issue of the South China Sea or the West Philippine Sea, there has been, we can say, we have not taken a very strong stance on protecting what has been internationally recognized as our own territory, right? So for whatever reason that happens, whether it's justified or unjustified, the fact is, hindi natin nagagawa yung sinasabing gagawin dapat ng Philippine government based on our constitution. So that's the value of a constitution. No? So along these three lines, we can analyze democratic development, participation, representation, which are related, of course, and protection of rights. So, yeah, those are the basics of democracy. Now, I've explained what the Constitution is a little bit here. Now, when we talk about the Philippine republics, each republic represents a different constitution. Or, as I mentioned earlier, the constitution as an agreement of what your government will look like. Literally, constitute, yung root word ng constitution. Yung parang mabubuo dapat na mga institusyon para masabi natin, okay, may gobyerno dito. At meron silang claim to rule. Right. So we talked about the Malolos Republic before very briefly, and you saw part of its Bill of Rights. So yun yung first republic natin, our first constitution, first visualization of a Philippine government. The Commonwealth Republic could be considered our second republic kasi nagkaroon tayo ng 1935 Constitution, which even lasted past the Commonwealth. Pero may mga nagsasabi din na technically, the Second Republic could also be the Laurel Republic under the Japanese kasi nagkaroon din ng constitution under the Japanese. So, na-mention na natin yan sa Module 7. No? Magulo yung period niya yan kasi may dalawang standing governments. One sponsored by the United States, one sponsored by the Japanese. So, we don't really need to establish which is the real government now. The point is, ito yung history natin of constitutional development. The Third Republic, would follow the 1935 Constitution. Pero the difference is, instead of being a Commonwealth Republic, we were now an independent state. So this 1935 Constitution would run from 1946 to 1972 with some amendments. And then come martial law, which is the Fourth Republic, no? Papalitan yung constitution natin through a CONCON or a Constitutional Convention in 1973. So, nag-iba yung hugis ng Philippine governance at the time. Tayo ay naging parliamentary government. Nag-iba yung relationship ng president with the military because of the declaration of martial law. At na-abrogate or I want to say na baliwala yung ibang constitutional protections sa Bill of Rights for citizens dahil nga sa special circumstances ng martial law. And then, of course, after 1987, pagkatapos ma-overthrow ni Marcos, nagkaroon na tayo ng Fifth Republic with the institution of a new constitution in 1987, which is still in effect up until the present day. So yeah, that's an overview of Philippine republics. You don't necessarily need to know all the details, but you should at least know what creates a republic in the Philippines, what a constitution is, what a democracy is in theory, and what constitutes democratic development. Okay, so yun yung theoretical part natin. The Philippines is a democratic representative republic, and now you know what that means if you didn't know yet before this lecture. Now, what are the challenges, though, to democratic development moving forward? We have to remember that the Philippines in this era was devastated by warfare coming out of World War II. Here's an image of the old Philippine Legislative Building bombed in the Battle of Manila. And it would have been such a gorgeous building, guys. Look at the scaffolding on this thing. I have another picture here. I think here's an image from the 1945 Battle of Manila, or the battle to liberate Manila from the Japanese. So, as we can see from the pictures now, one of the biggest problems was the reconstruction of the capital city Manila, as well as other devastated areas in the Philippines, such as Baguio. And I think it was these two cities na pinaka malala yung destruction. So, as the biggest American colony in Asia, the Philippines, therefore, was also one of the most devastated countries following World War II. So, we had to deal with that. How do you regrow your economy? How do you encourage foreign investors to come here and to grow the capital of the country again? Or how do you allow local businesses to grow from the ashes of World War II? Now, while there is a need to rebuild the economy, rehabilitation funds pour in from the United States. However, in exchange for special rights over Philippine resources such as land and agricultural goods, which we'll explain in a bit. So, yan yung challenges, no? You need to reconstruct. Ito yung funds. Kaso, kailangan yung i-amend yung constitution nyo para ibigay namin yung funds. So, makikita natin yung push and pull challenge later. But right now, let's talk about the problems first. So, Ayan, no, other problems were as we were trying to rebuild our democratic political system, kasi nga, democracy tayo according to our constitution, the country still faced problems of dirty politics and unequal development in cities and rural areas. So this actually becomes a problem, leading to a major rebellion called the Hook Rebellion, which runs from 1946 to 1954 and threatens to capture the Philippine seat of power. So yun yung local problem natin na pinakamalaki. Globally, the worldwide Cold War context leads the United States to intervene in Philippine military affairs. So, ang daming problema. Mag-rebuild ka na nga from the past war, eh ito may Cold War in the present, in the post-war period. How do you navigate these very complex issues in order to favor democratic development? It's very difficult. So here's an image, no, related to dirty politics. So this is a political cartoon from the Philippine Free Press, published on November 12, 1949, uh, in the context of the Quirino or Elpidio Quirino's election to presidency. So peaceful election daw, pero makikita natin na ang daming election violence lalo na sa rural areas of the Philippines. Okay. Here's an image related to the Cold War context. If you have been to Subic, medyo iconic yung rotunda na to. Ay, ano, I haven't been there often and I'm really bad at geography on the ground. Pero I remember seeing this when we enter Subic. So here's an American band nung fully, ano pa siya, US naval base. Okay, so we've talked about the general ideas which set the groundwork for the discussion. In the next part, we're going to talk about the general timelines and explain some of the global and local contexts, which help us understand the challenges to democratic development in the post war era.